purpose is to give various groups in the diversity spectrum as defined at LCC, give them the mic and shed light on various issues and concerns, to give people voice, and to try and start simple and work towards a common understanding for all. It's our hope that this might be the core nucleus of either diversity training or ongoing lecture series. In looking at this question of what gender is, I went to the my online dictionary, and gender is, they define it, is the sex of a person or organism or of a whole category of people or organisms, often used euphemistically to avoid the word sex. But often in our terminology, especially in the English language, it does come down to a person's sex and sexuality. A second definition is the classification of nouns and pronouns in certain languages according to the forms taken by adjectives, modifiers, and other grammatical items associated syntactically with them. And third, any one of the categories, for example, masculine, feminine, neuter, or common, into which nouns and pronouns are divided into languages that have gender. Now, interestingly, for me, when you start talking about that, then this question of gender, just if we go from that particular definition of female, then male, and then dealing with issues of sexuality, and then when we deal with issues of sexuality, then we get into the 5 genders if you want to use its most liberal definition. So hetero, which means different, homo, which means the same, bi or two, either or both. And then basically that's where we get your 5 genders: male, female, hetero, homo, bi, or other, if there is an other. When we get into the commonalities where we talk about in terms of civil rights or human rights, if you will, where we started with this particular topic with the acronym GLBTQI, also / Two-Spirit to use the native terminology for that. So gay is referring to, usually refers to a male homosexual, lesbian, female homosexual, bisexual. The T could be transsexual, transgender, transvestite, queer, or questioning. The intersex, a continuum which could include at one end of the spectrum 2 visible functional sets of external sex organs, either of which could be amputated at birth at the discretion of the doctor, often without the parent's knowledge, still leaving a person with the same genome that produced those sex organs. As reported on National Public Radio when this story was covered, basically one of the doctors said it's easier to make a hole than a pole. So for example, if you have what appears to the doctors to be a female child that has an extra large clitoris or almost a penis, then they simply amputate the penis at birth and then hand baby over, and then when the person has experiences puberty, of course their genome, which decides their feelings, begins to assert itself. One of our expected guests, Remy Calalang, and I came up with a construct we called CRASH, which was basically in response to a grant. The acronym CRASH stands for classism, racism, addiction, and also ability, sexism, and homophobia. And so when we look at these as interlocking forms of discrimination based on human differences, and we focus on the one we refer to as heterosexism and also homophobia, then there are a number of concepts that are useful for trying to get a handle and dealing with this particular difference and its attendant forms of discrimination, because CRASH is basically oriented towards teaching people how to deal productively with those differences. So the American Psychological Association in 1973 declared that homosexuality is not a deviation but part of normal human sexuality. And through that they came up with a condition referred to as gender identity dysphoria, which simply means that you don't feel good about your gender identity, whether assigned or assumed, and that's how it's mentioned in DSM-4. The World Health Organization of the United Nations in 1987 came up with basically the same definition and applied it on a global scale. And in terms of terminology, when we talk about intersex, we're talking about 3% of human births, which if you do the math, is about 4 million individuals a year. And the dictionary definition, of course, gives an organism with characteristics of both sexes. So assuming that the DNA code, as I like to think, knows what it's doing, one could take a variety of positions and incorporate this 3% of human births into a human society. So in our nomenclature of GLBTQI, which has basically come about in English in the late 20th century, early 21st century, the traditional understanding of two-spirited, for example, 7 genders, which we'll look at in just a second, and 12 kinds of marriage being practiced in Africa. Both two-spirited and 12 kinds of marriage take into account and incorporate multiple forms of human sexuality and ways of dealing with those responsibilities. So, for example, the question of same-sex unions, civil unions, gay marriage, et cetera, if you look at traditions practiced both on this continent, Turtle Island, and in Africa, both before colonization, but even the 12 kinds of marriage occurs today. We have a model for a form which could manifest, for example, as a South African government legalizing gay marriage and same-sex unions in at least a more broader context than we are willing to look at here in America. So within that, there's also issues within the crash construct of skin privilege, socioeconomic privilege, sexual orientation privilege, part of which is heterosexism, and the intersection of other isms, racism, classism, addiction, ability, who has what privileges and where. Oftentimes, as Remy Calalang pointed out, that gays and lesbians seem to have, when they're referred to in popular culture at all, a certain entertainment value, and basically she talked about Will and Grace, Queer Eye, for the straight guy, Girls Gone Wild, et cetera, when we talk about sexual diversity in Turtle Island, in 117 Native American languages, there's a word for a third gender. Now, usually, generically, the anthropological term is berdash, which is not even an indigenous word. It is the Arab word for a male sex slave. So whether there are female sex slaves, which is usually, the context that term is often used in, is an open question, but berdash is the general term that's being applied to Native Americans, at least in anthropology. So in 117 Native languages, there's a word for third gender. So generically translated into English as two spirits, the reference is to a sacred condition where spirit or creator is beyond gender. And since spirit is beyond gender, two spirits infuse two spirits within one body, and since the only person that does that is creator, these people are considered sacred. So, for example, among the Osage Nation, the concept of 7 genders, 5 of which are not heterosexual. So there's a word for each one of them: female hetero wako, male hetero mika, male body, female spirit, winte, male body, female spirit, wingshe, and these people participate in the Women's Secret Society, female rituals, joshi, female body, male spirit. These participate in the male secret societies. Joshi, female body, male spirit. And finally, Wakandiji, a person of mystery. They could inhabit either body and beyond the previous concepts. So each one of these, it's important to note, was and is functional within society with full citizenship rights. So oftentimes, one of the things that we're dealing with here is, especially in Turtle Island in our current American context, it's a continual fight to establish civil rights that actually used to exist and were granted to people before, shall we say, conquest. Now, I have a few slides that indicate this from a book called Spirit and the Flesh by Walter Williams. And Walter talks about sexual diversity in American Indian culture. And one of the things I wanted to show, just to show the how people were integrated in society and how that changed. These are people from the Temecula Nation. And you notice he uses the term Burdash, Temecula. Burdash is working with women carrying food. And then Temecula Burdash is transporting injured persons for medical treatment and deceased persons for burial. So the context here is there is a war going on between two different tribes. And what happens is they stop the battle, and then the male two-spirits go on to the battlefield and carry off the wounded and the dead of both sides, but are non-combatants. Since this is Florida, this then is also what happens when the Spanish, noting the position of these people within native societies, basically ordered the Indians accused of sodomy to be eaten alive by dogs. So one of my two-spirit informant that basically introduced me to this book talked about the fact that after this, the message went out through Indian country: don't talk about sex with white folks, because especially in terms of protecting your two spirits, because they'll be subject to attack. So, for example, then when you look at Plains Indians, Shoshone woman roping a horse, an activity often associated with stereotypically with men. There's also another painting of a woman hunting, Shoshone woman hunting. In Zuni culture, group of Zuni. Picture above is Wewa, who's a Zuni Burdash. This picture was taken in 1885. And then there's a picture, the picture below is Wewa in a group of men and women, standing between them, symbolizing that people of Wewa stature are often being used as marriage counselors in heterosexual marriages, because they're beyond containing both genders. They are neutral and can see both sides of that particular question. Wewa again, and then Atalawa, and Crow, Burdash. One of my informants, Terri basically talked about symbols for two-spirited people, traditional. So, for example, a dragonfly. So the symbolism behind a dragonfly is as a youth, it spends its time in water. When it comes into power and knows who it is as an adult, it takes wings and flies. Rain, because it connects and nourishes heaven and earth. Then in the Southwest, where women wear their hair in a bun and men loose, two spirits will wear, basically in the Southwest, hair in a bun and hair loose. And on the plains, women wear their hair in a braid, men wear their hair loose. And that's also the symbol for contrary. So when we talk about rainbows and other things like that, there are some symbols for two-spirited people that are pre-Columbian, and each one of those just four examples of that particular practice. When we get to in terms of the question of marriage, one of the things that I found useful is Audre Lorde's book Sister Outsider, where she talks about the Fon of Dahomey. The Fon were one of the African tribes that actually had women who participated as generals and as combat troops against Europeans. 12 kinds of marriage. One of them is known as giving the goat to the buck, where a woman of independent means marries another woman who then may or may not bear children, all of whom belong to the bloodline of the first woman. So if you want to think of it as marriage as a legal agreement in a society between two consenting adults to basically take care of children and elders and the succession of property, this is one model. So some marriages of this kind were arranged to provide heirs for women of means who wish to remain quote-unquote free, I assume of men, and some are lesbian relationships. Marriages like this occur throughout Africa in different places among different peoples. Routinely, the women involved are accepted members of the communities, evaluated not by their sexuality, but by their respective places within the community. This is Herskovits from his 2-volume set of Dahomey, published in '67. Audrey also quoted a 92-year-old Ifek Ibibio woman of Nigeria, who told about her love for another woman who was both were married to men, both had children. They were treated in the tribe as if they were sisters, and basically shared a number of resources. So our single guest tonight is Terri Sullivan, who's a test accommodation specialist at LCC Disability Services. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I'll leave the podium. So the question.
The question? Which question?
Regarding gender and GLBTQI, what are the most salient things that concern you?
Concern me, well,
the stereotype is, recently we had the whole thing with Reverend Fontroy and,
right.
Gay marriage, civil unions,
right,
et cetera, adoption rights, all kinds of things like that.
Well, probably the most burning issue for me or for most people at this point goes back to the question or the stereotype, why can't you just have your relationship and be quiet about it and not make a fuss about it and not make it an issue for everyone else?
Don't flaunt, in other words.
Or just don't talk about it. You can just have your relationship as long as no one else has to know about it. And for a lot of people, that's still, for a lot of gay people, they're still living that way. They're not out to their families, they're not out in their places of employment, but the issue behind that, or the unfairness around that, is that all gay couples then don't have the same basic rights that other people in relationships do. Rights of survivorship, rights of kinship, the right. In my past, when my partner had a heart attack, I had to say that I was her sister to be admitted to the hospital, because as her partner I wouldn't have been. here in Eugene, and within
had
the
to-
last
yeah,
20
right, you had to
years.
be a blood
I had to
relative.
lie and say I was a blood relative to be able to go into the hospital at all. So it's not about, or at least when you're my age, it's not about being political, and it's not about being militant, and it's not about being obnoxious. It's about, there are certain needs as a unit that have to be taken care of that have no legal way to be taken care of at this time. If something were to happen to my partner, I could still conceivably be banned from the hospital. So we, because we live in the 21st century in the United States, have gone out and had drawn up durable powers of attorney for each other and living wills for each other, and created a huge pile of documentation that grants us all of the same rights that one 20-minute ceremony in a judge's chambers would do. As far as who takes care of whom, and who gets what, and who can go to the hospital, and who can make decisions in the event that one of us isn't capable of speaking for ourselves. Those are huge issues. It's terrifying to think that my mother or her daughter might intervene in a medical emergency and do things that were totally contrary to what we've agreed we want for ourselves. And that can happen. It does happen.
And have more power than you in that situation.
Absolutely. Her daughter could walk into the hospital and say, I'm a blood relative, she's not, and have me evicted. So that's probably the biggest concern. There's lots of little ones.
That's pretty major.
Yeah,
there.
that would be the most important issue to me. And my partner and I did get married in Multnomah County when it was legal in Multnomah County. We did not have a religious ceremony. We went to a Multnomah County Circuit Court judge. And then we got our licensing fees back a year later when they decided that none of those were going to be legal. That's still being fought in the courts.
Right.
And appealed.
Right.
But that would be the most important concern to me. Secondarily is the whole GLBTQI, the need for labels and more labels and more labels and more differentiations and more definitions and more. And it's not just labels being placed on us by people who are trying to categorize the gay community. I mean, it's labels that the gay people have picked for themselves, and sometimes inappropriately, I think. For instance, I don't refer to myself as being a lesbian because I think that the word is separatist and politically motivated and negatively connotated, so I don't use it. But lots of people do. I just don't see the need to make more separations. I liked gay. Gay fit on a t-shirt. Everybody was gay, everybody was happy. Gay Pride Parade was one line. I liked that. So
what is it with? Why do you feel that people? Why do you think that people feel the need to have terminology? And as you pointed out, there is a politic to it. But a label. I mean, if I use like a bottle of ketchup, for example, with I'm Heinz 57. Okay, so that's a label, and you got ingredients, but that doesn't tell us the story of how you're made up.
Part of it is, everybody's need to differentiate. I mean, it's like groups have names and cliques have names, and so a group forms its own liturgy, its own terminology.
You mean now?
So,
sorry.
And part of it is being imposed from outside. All sorts of terminology has been made up to be applied to gay people, either medical terminology or like you're talking about. Intersexed is what they used to call hermaphrodism,
yeah, right.
And bisexual is for lots of gay people say are just people who don't want to admit that they're gay. There's a huge portion of the gay community who doesn't admit that bisexuality is a legitimate choice. So there's bigotry and prejudice even within the gay community itself. And part of it is like other groups have tried to take the negative terminology that's been applied to them but from the larger society and internalize it and make it their own and take possession of it and use it. There are lots of insider terms that were
Like-
used to be pejorative terms, like queer. Queer
Okay.
used to be a pejorative term in any application, and any person who was gay would take offense at it. Now, then it was adopted by the gay community in reference to itself, and now it has then cycled back out and become a socially acceptable term. It's used in, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, and the Queer Student Alliance, and it's become an everyday term. But for me, there's still that little glitch, because when I was up and coming, when I was young, it was a pejorative term. So it's hard for me to view it as socially acceptable at
Yeah.
this juncture,
Yeah.
because it still has negative connotations for me. And then the terminology keeps changing. When I came out, I would have been referred to in my community as a butch dyke. Now they would call me transgendered. I'm not transgendered. I'm a girl, and I know I'm a girl, and I'm happy being a girl. I just don't dress like one. But the terminology is changing, and the definitions are changing, and I haven't kept up.
Well, during that whole Reverend Fontroy business, where for those of you who weren't here or are seeing this and aren't connected with Eugene, for the Martin Luther King celebration, one of Martin's comrades in arms, so to speak, the Reverend Walter Fontroy, who was there, marched with Martin, basically was invited to come speak, and members of the gay community objected to him coming to speak because he was against gay marriage. Now, he's for civil unions, he advocates for, he does gay relationship counseling between gay couples in his church, but he can't, he says, look, I'm Southern Baptist, my denomination doesn't support that. That's where I'm at. And so, again, having participated in numerous debates within that particular subject in town myself, and looking at the fact that, okay, from the point of view of the black heterosexual community who said, oh, this is not a big thing, they're all married, they all have the rights to which you would like to be applied to you universally, and which, as we know from my little history lesson, were applied. And it's not so much about, what your label is, but, you're human, you have human needs and all that kind of stuff. So the whole Reverend Fontroy controversy about, marriage and, the politicizing, all those things.
Over-politicizing all those things.
Yeah. But some would say not politicized enough, because we still don't have rights, and we still don't have, the same rights as everyone else.
But Martin Luther King Day is not the venue to debate that in. When he was invited, he is a contemporary of Martin Luther King. He marched with him. He, stood on the same stage with him. He has the same history. He's how many times has he been a congressman? He epitomized the things that we say that we're celebrating on Martin Luther King Day. He epitomized the fight for civil rights and the peaceful demonstration and pacifism and all those things that are really inherent in the original civil rights movement. And he's not opposed to civil rights for gays. He's opposed to homosexual marriage, as in the religious part of the ceremony. Right. And lots of gay couples have chosen to have bonding ceremonies that didn't involve Judeo-Christian religious symbology in them, which is totally legitimate. And I, for myself personally, don't think that it was appropriate to oppose him being the keynote speaker at the Martin Luther King celebration because his church doesn't support religious gay matrimonial ceremonies. It just seemed like a non-issue.
Well, definitely, as you know, it definitely was an issue for a lot of folks.
Mm-hmm. And continues to be.
Yeah. And, there is ongoing work to kind of heal the rift, so to speak. I mean, But I think one of the things that could happen is we start looking at what would, for example, I guess the next question, how did you or could you construct a healthy identity for yourself? I mean, if you could talk about your process, for example.
Well,
like, you know, the statement, I'm a girl. I just happen, you know, I don't dress like one.
I just don't dress like one. But when I was growing up, I'm older than the generation that attends at this college for the most part. But when I was growing up, it was all right to be, because I grew up in a rural community, it was all right to be a tomboy because we had to plant the seeds and hoe the weeds and harvest the vegetables and buck the bales and do all that and cut the wood and all that stuff. That was part of where we lived. So, you know, you wore flannel shirts and jeans and you did all that mucky, dirty work, and that was cool. And we were naive where I came from, and so you were just a tomboy, and that was fine. And I grew up in the military, so I grew up in an extremely multicultural universe, and so when I came out, wasn't unhealthy. I had no issues with it. I wasn't upset by it or afraid of it, or I didn't have any big religious, shattering religious horrifying thing, because I grew up in multi-denominational Protestant churches, so I didn't get any particular anti-gay dogma, because they were talking to 20 different Protestant participants all in one room, because they only had 3 services on the base. A Protestant service, a Catholic service, and a Jewish service. So you kind of had to generically fit into one of those 3. And that was cool. I liked that because I didn't get any particular denominations, biases, or dogmatic views crammed into my head when I was still in my formative years. But my family didn't deal with it well for a long time. They've come around. But I took my cues from my first partner, because I knew nothing. I knew no gay people, or I did, but I didn't know that I knew gay people. I didn't know that I found out after we were all 21 and could be in the bars who was gay from my high school, but there was no one out in my high school, and I came out after I graduated. So I was introduced to what it was to be a gay woman and how that looked. And unfortunately, most of my training was in the bar community, because my first partner liked to dance and hung out in the bar crowd, which isn't necessarily the healthiest place to come out, but in those days, in the early 80s, that was the only place gays were out.
Right.
You weren't out at home, you weren't out at work, you weren't out at church, the only place people went to be out was inside a bar. Right. And when you left the bar, you weren't out anymore. If you crossed the street next to somebody that you'd spend all evening with, you didn't know them. That was part of the rules. There was lots of rules when I was coming
moving
out.
closet.
Right. If you saw them in any other context but in the bar, you didn't know them, and they didn't know you. And it was kind of schizophrenic, but those were the rules. I mean, and in some ways the rules were better than they are now, because you also didn't out somebody. You didn't tell everybody else that they were gay. You didn't tell their families or their employers or whatever. And now that's the first thing people do when they break up to get even. They call and tell your mom. They call and tell your boss. They muck about in your world in ways that aren't appropriate, in ways that can be detrimental to your life. And in the old days, that would never happen.
So in other words, you use the system of discrimination that you were both subject to against the person.
Against whoever you were mad at for whatever reason. Or in Portland, if you're gonna run for a drag title, the first thing you have to be is out to every aspect of your universe, because whoever's running against you will tell anyone who doesn't know, whether that's your employer or your parents or your church or your neighborhood. It's become nasty, and outing has become incredibly popular politically and in the media. They like to find out famous people who are gay and tell everyone that they are. And I understand that lots of gay people feel like, and if more people who are quote-unquote famous or quote-unquote popular or quote-unquote powerful were out, then there would be more commonality and more acceptance in the general society for gay people. I don't necessarily think that's true. It certainly hasn't been so far. And I think telling people should be a personal choice. So I don't like the whole media outing thing, and I don't like the political outing thing. And yes, I think it's incredibly wrong that conservative Republicans who are anti-gay in all their speeches turn out to be gay people themselves. That's sad. I feel sorry for them, but I don't think we have a responsibility to out people. I'm really fundamentally, philosophically opposed to it, as convenient as it might be.
Yeah. But all that happens in a social context where people are discriminated against, and I guess what would you think an alternative would be?
I don't think. I used to say gay civil rights were never going to be legislated, and I can't be bothered to be that political. I said it for a lot of years, until folks started trying, Lon Mabon and all those folks started trying to pass actively anti-gay legislation.
Right.
At which point,
You're
even
under
though I have
attack,
no
so-
interest
right.
in it, I have to get on
Right.
a battered old white horse and go be political for gay civil rights, because somebody's out there trying to make anti-gay civil rights legislation. But I don't think legislation is going to be the thing that makes the difference either. We legislate a lot of things that don't seem to change things very much. I really think, I wish that everyone who was gay or bi or even thought they might be ever once were out, and everybody knew it, because I really think that kind of acceptance is a generational thing. It's going to happen generationally, just like all the other major changes have happened. It's going to happen because my neighbors all know I'm gay, and my employers all know I'm gay, and my friends all know I'm gay, and they like me anyway. They like me for who I am, not what I am. And they don't raise their kids to beat people up or throw rocks at them or burn their houses or anything. And their kids aren't going to raise their kids to be that way. And that's going to have a trickle-down effect. And eventually it's going to be a non-issue. The thing is, if it were, don't ask, don't tell. If it weren't against the rules to be gay in the military, then they couldn't use the fact that you were gay in the military against you, and you wouldn't be a security risk because you might give up secrets so that they wouldn't out you to the military that you were gay. It's the world's most famous great big giant spinning catch-22. If it wasn't a problem to be gay in the military, there would be no threat to security. There would be no issue with which you could be manipulated or coerced or black. There would be nothing. It would be a non-issue. And it's the same, it's the same in general.
How do you think we get to that point? You mentioned kids, the children, that it'd be a generational thing that, because that's one of the later questions in terms of having been part of the Rites of Passage program since its inception here at Lane, one of the most consistent requests came, well, why don't you do Rites of Passage for gay and lesbian youth? And so our consistent answer back, and it usually was white lesbians that would bring that up, and we'd say, okay, fine, how do you do that? Because different communities of color handle that whole question differently. The healthiest one that I'd seen was basically pre-Columbian, Native Americans who at least had, the 7 genders thing, the 2-spirit thing. But how do you socialize youth? Because as you pointed out, the whole bar thing doesn't work. And I've actually talked about, socializing youth with gays and lesbian, and they would always reference the bar thing. And I go, well, the whole, besides being the drug counselor, I can't really advocate that. And
right.
How about a sober, coming out? How about a sober, how do you construct that sober identity that's based on pride and competence and not fear and judgment?
And how do you have a rites of passage program? Because rites of passage is sort of adolescence to adulthood,
right.
Junior high to high
right.
school, sort of a transitioning thing. And in each of the groups that are currently meeting on this campus, there's a whole culture behind that process, that graduating process, like bar mitzvah in the Jewish community.
Right.
There's a cultural reason for that. How do you make that same correlation if you're talking about gay youth? There's no correlation. Who are you going to get to be a healthy role model? How are you going to decide who's a healthy role model?
Mm-hmm.
Do you choose gay people who pass for straight people? Is that a healthy role model? Or do you choose, Butch Dykes and Flamin' Fairies? Is that a healthy role model? Who's going to pick?
Lipstick lesbians?
Right. Who's going to make the decision, and what's going to be the thing that epitomizes? Or do you have a panel of like the whole spectrum? And you're talking about, when you're talking about middle school, junior high, young high school kids, you're talking about an incredibly messed up, confused time anyway around issues of sexuality.
Yes.
And let's face it, when you're talking about gay, lesbian, bi, you're talking about sexuality. And I personally don't see, let me make sure I'm saying this for myself personally, I don't see how you can create a rites of passage program like that around middle school, junior high, that's around middle school, junior high sexuality and going to high school. It's really awkward. Plus, if you were to support a program like this, I'm not saying it's true, but there would be a huge heterosexist backlash saying you're just trying to turn kids into gays and lesbians. It's that whole mythology that gays and lesbians are out to get your children and make them into more gays and lesbians.
Yes.
And molest them and turn them in.
Right.
There's no way around that. There's no way around having that backlash. Every major city that's ever had a gay lesbian youth group has had that problem. That they're incredibly careful in the high school programs to make sure that the advisors aren't gay, or if they are, they aren't out, so that there's not any whiff of there's gay people influencing my children to be gay. That's a huge, visceral lizard brain fear that promotes a lot of the heterosexist violence and stuff that goes on. You're out to get our kids.
Right.
How are you going to have a kids program that doesn't make somebody say that? And what are going to be the criteria you base their rites of passage on?
Well, just what you've said is more conversation than we've had on the topic in all the years that we've had the program, because every year it comes up. So yeah, there besides the backlash issue, who is the role model, and who, I can think of some, and there's reasons why, I say that sexual orientation is a legitimate civil rights, human rights struggle, because sexual diversity is a human reality, and that in societies that are older and I believe healthier than America, that it was incorporated integrally into society. In fact,
a long time ago.
Well, right.
It's been dealt with a long time ago. It's done.
Right, yeah, a long time ago. But if we were talking about the 21st century then, and if we did have, the conceptual framework to identify people, because, a number of people, for example, part of the identity question was, I've heard people say, I knew when, I've always known, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the traditional and native people that I've talked to said, well, there was a training program for two-spirits. They were recognized from birth. They were encouraged, when they showed certain tendencies to hang with one gender or the other, dress one way or the other, or showed other tendencies in terms of, and also abilities, to be able to interface between genders in a way that indicated their particular status.
And going with the 3% statistics,
right.
Some of them were hermaphroditic to begin with.
Right.
So.
Right. So you had those visible signals without the concept of genital mutilation. Right. So there was some acceptance there, and some training. So. In fact, the intersex is often one of the concepts I use to try not a concept, it's a reality, and the place that I usually go is, okay, look, unless you're going to say that the devil's controlling the DNA code, this is intentional. This is an option. What if there were an actual purpose?
Well, and the place I usually go is that the doctor can choose wrong.
Yes.
Because there are, in my community, there are all sorts of stories about, you know, even when the doctor consults the parents, you've got both, do you want a boy or a girl? 99 times out of 100, parents choose boys.
Right.
And then you get somebody who's a biological boy, who is being raised as a biological boy, who starts to have a period through his penis when he's 16, they picked wrong. You know, who's never felt like a boy, didn't want to be
Right.
raised like a boy, thought he
Right.
was gay, when actually
Right.
he was female.
Right.
There's a lot of that in this
You're
country.
not making this up. This is a real event, right? And so,
It absolutely
yeah.
happened. And when he had gender reassignment surgery and became a woman, his father said, "You're a lovely person, and I'm sure you're going to be really nice and have a really nice life, but I disown you, I don't know you because I raised a son."
So there's a couple of pieces. It's not just the kids. It's also parents that would need to go through, well,
You're talking about changing things
in society,
in the
really.
society
Right.
on a fundamental level. Since before you're born, they already are. Your parents are finding out what your gender is, and they're already starting the whole gender socialization process, heterosexist gender socialization process before you're even born.
Right.
They're giving you a name. They're talking to you about what you should likes and dislikes should be. The television tells you from the moment you can see it what a boy's likes and dislikes should be, what a girl's likes and dislikes should be, what a boy's roles are, what a girl's roles are, and they're very rigid and they're not really healthy and they're not even really true anymore. But societally, we're still putting that message out every second. And young men who are effeminate and young women who are masculine don't get any support, never mind from birth, don't get any
Right.
support through their
Right.
whole lives
Right.
for how to deal with that.
Right. So that question of identity, again, I mean, coming up with a defense. Well, because, you know, I don't necessarily, I mean, it's the nearest equivalent that I can even think about, you know, being a heterosexual black man is like, okay, wanting to be white in the 4th grade, right? And you can't ever be that. Forget it. Not going to happen, right? So being an effeminate boy or a masculine girl, if there were in fact role models for that, and basically people who made a successful transition, whatever successful means, through the gauntlet of the backlash.
That's
right?
pretty, yeah.
You know, I mean, that's the piece. I mean, that's a part of the piece that I got in basically negotiating a largely white world, right? Basically using class to overcome that, even though that wasn't totally overcoming that. And part of what, you know, I was trying to allude to with looking at, you know, for example, you know, if we were going to be talking about, say, any corporate environment, you know, race and class play into sexual orientation quite a bit in terms of acceptance.
And gender plays into it quite a bit in terms of advancement opportunity.
Yes.
So, yeah,
Right.
it's huge.
Right.
And it's not healthy, and it's this country. I mean, that's the way things are. I had to decide 25 years ago that I would never be a high school English teacher. When I was first choosing my path to college, well, 30 years ago now, I would never be a high school English teacher, and I still could never be a high school English teacher. We're talking 21st century America. People say it's all good and everything's fine, but you can't look like me and teach high school English for any school I've ever met. It's still that way. And I'm a lousy liar.
So you're a lousy what?
I'm a lousy liar. I can't lie and use gender non-specific terms to talk about my life, and I don't, if I were to change the way I dress, I'd look like a truck driver in drag. I don't do it well. It's just, I'm not good at it. So I made the choice a long time ago, and a high school English teacher was what I was meant to be, but I won't be that.
So what would you have to be a high school English teacher in terms of, so it's not even about content of your character for you.
Oh, no.
It's
for me, it's about, I would have to make just huge changes in my attitude. I'd have to learn to lie about my life and my relationships and my family. I would have to change my appearance to be more stereotypically, correctly, heterosexually female looking. It'd be huge, and I wouldn't be able to pull it off. So I'm not going to try. The fact that that matters is the problem.
Yeah.
The fact that you can't be Carson from Queer Eye for the Straight Guy and teach high school English is the problem. You know, he's charming and bright and incredibly effete, so he would never get a job teaching high school English. And I wouldn't for being Butch for the same reason. And that's unfortunate. But who's going to decide? There are a lot of people who consider me an anachronism. I am not appropriate in my own subculture because I won't dress to pass. I won't look right to go along, to get along, to be invisible so that we can be more accepted. How accepted can you be if you're invisible?
Well,
if you're
you can't
invisible,
be
you're just
accepted if you're invisible.
That's right. You're just not noticeable. So, you know, parts of my subculture think that the drag queens and the dykes on bikes and the butch women and the effete men should all disappear and be really quiet and get swept under the carpet so that them that look like everybody else can go along happy.
But
hiding.
And hiding. All right. So the closet doesn't really serve anybody's purposes, except to keep people down.
Right. Not unless people like to lie. Or I work in an educational setting. People talk. Just in your general day, you learn little things about each other, little things about your families. There's pictures on people's desks. There's conversations about weekend activities. The sheer energy invested in lying about every aspect of that every day of your life, I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it.
And it's fortunate that you don't have to.
Right, I don't, but it limits some of my opportunities that I don't choose to lie. I'd have a lot more doors open for me if I did.
So let's say those doors opened. What would that look like for you?
I'd get a K through 12 teaching degree and teach high school literature and high school writing. Just that fast. That's the only change it would make in my life. It wouldn't. I'm out in every aspect of my life. It wouldn't change anything else except my career choices at this juncture.
Any final thoughts? We're coming up on 2 minutes. Is that right? 2? That was 2. Okay.
Well, for final thoughts, I look forward to the day or the hour or the minute when these kinds of conversations